In honor of Jewish Book Month, JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
I'm just going to read a tiny bit from the very beginning of the novel, which is someone looking back on an obsessive relationship with a man from a distance. In this story, there is no final scene, no decisive change of heart or firm resolve, so much as a furious inner struggle, a struggle that has left no discernible traces, yet has marked me as surely as bruises after a fall. Because there is no end to the hunger for unconditional love, and no end to my belief that he was the one to give it to me. I have no stopwatch to measure how long the experience of sexual pleasure, of losing yourself, lasts at any particular time. It could be 10 minutes or 15 or 22. How do you measure the crest of a wave? All I know is that when it vanishes, it leaves in its wake a devouring appetite for more. To this day, I can't forget how he was always touching me in bed, acting as though my skin came as a surprise. You feel so soft, he said, so smooth. Nothing very original in that, I realize, and yet coming from him, I felt it as a lovely succumbing, a weakening of his ordinary resistance. Then there is this: I am a writer, a believer in the powers of art to shape experience so that others might recognize something of themselves in it, except when it comes to my own life, it appears. I have decided to tell this story now, after all these years, as a way of forcing it to the finish line. I am still confused about how I got to that place to begin with, and how I got out without going mad, howling like a wolf. I think it had something to do, despite all evidence to the contrary, with some intact shred of a life force. I willed him out of my life in order to pursue a more sane existence, one that would include a husband and children, a daughter I would bring up to feel full in herself, without vast absences or ravaging needs. But it was just that, an effort of will rather than a natural ending, only a sense that if I wanted to survive, I would have to move on.
So, thank you.
Welcome.
So, the 2 pages you just read were, a first-person account by the protagonist, Judith Stone, right, who is the author of the book within the book, basically.
Right.
Right. The book is told from the perspective of Judith Stone, who's telling the story of her own life, and in some number of years earlier, right? Indeterminate number of years before. What I found very interesting reading it, and was a little bit confusing sometimes, maybe even uncomfortable, was that she tells her story not in the first person. This is what happened to me. I said, I met him, I fell into this relationship, I fell out of this relationship. But she tells the story in the third person. She's writing a novel kind of about Judith Stone, and popping in every once in a while, kind of like reading over your shoulder. So I'm just interested, what made you decide to write the story that way? What did you find interesting about that kind of framing?
I would preface that by saying it took me 30 years to write this novel. I started it many, many years ago. At that time, it was called The Discovery of Sex, which I later decided was, for lack of a better word, too frontal a title, and that it also sounded a little bit like a high school hygiene book. So eventually I came to this title. I had tried it many different ways. I wanted to give the story of this compelling, primarily erotic obsession some distance. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I've always been interested as a ex-graduate student in English, I've always been interested in how people frame their stories. So I wanted it told, refracted through Judith Stone, the older version of the narrator who has gotten out of this relationship and is telling it from within it. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I did that was for many years I couldn't figure out how women in particular get out of obsessive relationships short of killing themselves like Anna Karenina or going crazy, as happened in a book called 9.5 Weeks. They're sort of hauled off to institutions. And I wanted to write about a woman who felt she couldn't get out of a bad relationship and eventually does. So that was one of the reasons I framed it after the fact.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would have been different about kind of framing it as a first-person memoir? You know, say Judith Stone writes her autobiography or writes her memoir saying, you know, this is what happened to me, this is what I did from a distance, as opposed to, you know, writing a story about a woman who happens to be named Judith Stone.
Right. Among the many, many versions of this book, far too many versions, one of them early on was simply straight, mm-hmm. not memoir. I guess if I wanted to write a memoir, I would have called it a memoir. Although, as I once said, most readers tend to read the author into the character. And if you write in first person, you've totally lost the battle to keep them apart. I originally did it straight on, but that also limited me. Mm-hmm. There are these parts, but I'll wait for you, you know, where I really enter. Mm-hmm. They're called, what are they called?
Digressions?
Digressions. There are 5 digressions, I think, in the book where someone, either the older either the older Judith Stone or third presence comments essayistically on what's going on in the novel and also addresses the reader and says, well, what's your sex life like? And what do you think of, you know, one of the digressions brings in Queen Victoria and the Victorian approach to sex, which is lie back and think of England. And those digressions discuss other things like Post-its, which have always fascinated me. So in a way, the book has 3 angles.
I mean, to a certain degree, it was kind of like reading a story with somebody kind of reading over your shoulder, like watching
Right.
you reading the book, which, you know, to a certain degree is very uncomfortable, especially when it's a book about a very sexualized, uncomfortable relationship.
Right.
It's the sort of book you kind of want to read to yourself, and yet there's this like narrator figure who's like kind of watching you over the shoulder saying, so what'd you think about that? Or I hope you feel uncomfortable now.
Right.
Was that something you were trying to do deliberately?
Well, I think of one line in which I say, you're not the reader I want after all.
Well, who's saying that?
One of the digressions.
Right.
Who could be the writer.
Or could be you.
Right. Truthfully, I've been told the book is a very quick read. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I think it's that uncomfortable making. I think I wanted to implicate the reader, not keep this, oh, that's happening out there, but here is my life smugly separate. Also, as a former graduate student who studied deconstruction and semiotics, the one phrase that stayed with me was perforating the text, meaning that you go in and puncture the pristine separateness of the story. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to puncture it, to enter. It interests me a lot to try to talk to the reader
So I'll tell you what I was kind of thinking about when I was reading the digressions and getting that like uncomfortable sense of somebody watching me reading a book like this. I remember reading an article a number of years ago when 50 Shades of Grey came out. And Kindles had just become like a really big thing around that same time. And the article tried to make the point that one of the reasons why 50 Shades of Grey was such a big seller, why it sold so many copies, is because you were able to read it on your Kindle so that you can be at the park or on the train or on the bus or at work or whatever it was, and you could be reading it, and nobody would know that you're reading it, right? Because all they see is the Kindle. And you kind of create this kind of world around yourself where you can kind of read it and you can get whatever pleasure you get out of reading it, but it's like a very private sort of thing. And to a certain degree, what you're doing by inserting this narrator with the digressions is kind of like interrupting that. You're kind of like, you couldn't read it by yourself because this other character is constantly like interrogating you to like stop and face, face reading it.
I think partly that is my natural tendency in my writing to expose secrets.
You're trying to get, so the reader being uncomfortable is part of the point.
I don't know if I think the reader is totally uncomfortable. I think the reader is, as I said, dragged in. I think I want to resist the comparison to 50 Shades of Grey, of which I was sent, I believe, 6 galleys. I got to page 60. I don't think anyone needed to be careful about reading 50 Shades of Grey because I thought it was the most boring version of power disparity I'd ever read. But I do think people are private about their innermost interests. People are private until something happens and everyone realizes that I'm not the only strange person in the world. I think it was Somerset Maugham, an underrated writer, who said the normal is the rarest thing. We all worry we're not normal enough, who is normal, who isn't normal. In some ways, this novel was an attempt to say that normality is a relative construct.
I think that brings up the next question even, which is, the title is 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love, but at least from my take, there seems to be very little love in the relationship that's the center of the book. So I'm just wondering kind of what you do with that. Speaking about normal versus not normal or different ways of sort of framing relationships people get into, do you think that this was actually like a loving relationship?
You asked me in horror. No.
No, I'm just asking.
I don't. I think I made pretty clear in the book that I don't. I actually think unconditional love is a concept we're all burdened by. The fewest people get it. If you're very lucky and you have the right parents, you get it as a very young child. I think in the case of this novel, the narrator, Judith Stone, has been sufficiently emotionally deprived, let's say, growing up, neglected in some ways, that she mistakes Howard Rose's possessiveness of her and fixation on her for unconditional love, when in truth it's a form of domination. But
do you think she sees that by the end of the book, that I thought it was love at the time, but now it's not? Or do you think she's still kind of wistful about it in that kind of way?
Truthfully, I think she sees it early in the book, practically from the moment they meet at a party. You can't think someone is very loving who the day after he meets you calls and begins the conversation by saying bitch. You'd have to be... I think what she continues to miss, I don't want to give away the last scene or the ending of the book, but I think what she continues to miss is the excitement, the heat, maybe I don't think that kind of sexual obsession holds up well to domestic life. I mean, they're completely not domesticated, the two of them.
Right. She speaks in the beginning about freedom and autonomy.
Right.
Why is autonomy such a good thing? Maybe not having autonomy is a good thing.
Right. I said unfreedom has its virtues, because we're a culture, unlike, let's say, Papua New Guinea, where they walk around, or they used to, with babies in papooses, and there wasn't this enormous emphasis on differentiation from the parent and autonomy. I think I say autonomy can be lonely. Mm-hmm. And I think people actually look for ways around autonomy, whether through family, whether through community. It's hard work just going through life on your own.
Right, and she's trying, and to a certain degree, even though now she has a husband and she has a child and she's part of a family unit, she still feels kind of by herself that way. Thinking back about when she was with somebody else who was borderline abusive, but was kind of attentive, fixated in that kind of way.
Right.
Yeah.
I think she does look back on it.
So, I guess the next question then is in that same kind of sense. Right, we're kind of getting her perspective of this relationship. It's her. She's writing the story.
Right.
She's, to a certain degree, she's even fictionalizing it, right? Because she's not writing I, she's writing Judith.
Right.
Right. She's putting it in the third person. Right. Do you think she's like a reliable narrator of what actually played out, or does that not even matter in terms of how you read the book?
No, it's interesting you asked that, because another of the things that graduate school is obsessed with is the development of the unreliable narrator. An example of that is, one of the best examples is a book called The Good Soldier by Ford Maddox Ford. And by the end of it, you don't know which story to believe. I think within this, the narrator, not the protagonist, even comments that for all one knows, Howard Rose was really in love with her and she failed to see it. Mm-hmm. So she's a very partial narrator. I don't think entirely unreliable. She's not overtly fabricating, melodramatic events.
Meaning, in terms of the narrative of her life, basically, meaning she wants to get to the point where this was the exciting fling that she had, but now she's graduated to a more stable place, and she's kind of framing her story so that it gets her from point A to point B. You're saying something along those lines?
Something along those lines, yes. Okay. Right.
So I'm interested also, just in terms of the way that the chronology of the book works, mm-hmm. Right? The cover flap of the book, right, says that this is narrated by Judith in a time before the Me Too movement, right? The word, the Me Too movement doesn't pop up in the book itself. Nobody mentions it.
Purposely.
Right? But the publisher sees the need to put that into the cover flap.
I didn't agree with that.
Right. This took place before Me Too. So does that matter?
Well, I would say the following. It's supposed to end in the sort of early, mid-2000s. I think, first of all, I famously or infamously came out with an op-ed at the beginning of Me Too, suggesting that I had problems with some of its approach. And I think it was called What Women Think as opposed to what they say about Me Too. And a lot of the women I knew had many thoughts mm-hmm. beside, and I said I had trouble with seeing all men as predatory, all women lacked agency, and couldn't say, go get off me, that there were other nuances going on. So I think I actually have a piece in the Washington Post coming out about being a contrarian, which I can't help but being, I think. The advent of Me Too helped me finish the book. I thought, I want to write about a certain kind of sexuality. Mm-hmm. a certain yen for submission. And I once did a piece for the Times Magazine called The Last Taboo, in which I interviewed a whole range of women, and uniformly they said their fantasy was being taken over by a man. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if Me Too has changed it. I tend to think politics don't change the psyche. And I'm sure there are women who do not have that fantasy, but I wanted to set it before Me Too, fully realizing that by Me Too standards, this is politically incorrect. Not only is it not about consent,
it's about a power imbalance by definition, right?
Right.
You know, I was, to a certain degree, I was kind of thinking that this book is almost a response, or it's a continuation of that op-ed, right?
Yeah.
Because it's showing you an example of a woman who is in a power imbalance, right? In a relationship that she said is going to leave her in tatters if she stays within it and she forces herself out. But she's able to look back on it, not necessarily positively, but at least as like a building block. As like a building block,
right?
Like
in her development,
life, right?
I think also I would just interrupt and say, one of the many titles I fiddled with was Bad Taste. I think a lot of women go through a period of in their lives, often when they're young, when romantic fervor is at its peak, and pick men who are, quote, not good for them. I certainly have many friends who went through that. And then they eventually move on to, and usually the men who are not good for them, I might add, are men who they find sexually alluring. I don't know if there's some equation, but they eventually move on. So I think for her, and I think also, a lot of us have psychological holes that need to be filled, and I don't mean this as a sexual pun, I mean it literally, holes that need to be filled, and you can pick the wrong person who seems to be filling it.
So do you think this story couldn't be set nowadays, or it would be more controversial if it were set nowadays? The relationship part, meaning the relationship part of it. Meaning nowadays there are still damaged people who find themselves in imbalanced relationships that fill certain needs for them.
I think those relationships continue as much as ever, Me Too or no Me Too. I think if I wrote it with Me Too in mind, there would have to be many more qualifications saying, well, of course she realized he was not a man who would let her. I mean, one thing we're leaving out, which I think is important to the novel, is Judith Stone is also very involved in her profession. She's not only living
this relationship
for the affirmation from this man, she is a book editor. My personal belief is there's some of the best scenes of the book are set in book publishing, which is a world I knew because I was in it for 6 years, and it's a very peculiar world. Since most books don't sell, and there's always big excitement about what might sell. So it's not like she's someone with no sense of identity.
Right.
And is waiting like an empty vessel to be filled.
Right, okay, I know. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. What is it, maybe like just build on that a little bit more then. So if this story really could take place then, or it could take place now, or it kind of works within or without any particular political kind of setting.
True.
Right? So what was it about, let's say, the 80s or so, when the book seems to be set, right? There's still like payphones and things like that that are around. So what was it about that particular setting that made you want to put the relationship then?
Right. It's the late 80s or early 90s. I myself was nostalgic for payphones. I purposely did not want it contemporary, totally. I don't think I was nostalgic for big hair, which I also associate with that period. But it was a time before the complete takeover by social media, which I think has changed the way men and women conduct themselves and meet. So I wanted that out. And in that way, have it be a little more traditional. Not that you got an email that said, let's hang out tonight, whatever it's called, hookups. But even if the man called and said, bitch, he was still asking the woman out. There was some semblance of courtship. So that was one of the things that interested me. And other details that pertain to that period, which are escaping me beside the phone booth at the moment.
So we only get to see Howard, right, the man in the relationship through the eyes of Judith, right? You know, through the eyes of Judith 20 some odd years before, and through Judith 10 years. Okay, 10 years before, and Judith now, you know, writing the story of what happened those number of years before. Do you think Howard is as kind of one-dimensional as Judith kind of portrays him as, or do you sort of have the sense that you would be able to write Howard as a more complex character if you were writing a different book?
Complicated question. I considered writing the story from two sides, from Howard and Judith's. I'm not sure I find Howard quite as one-dimensional. He's one-dimensional with her.
Right.
I think he's a man, and she says it at some point, that she had this feeling that they could heal each other, that he's a man with his own lacks and has found himself, by being a lawyer and an aggressive lawyer, but we don't know. As that's why I said, for all we know, maybe he secretly adored Judith Rose and she didn't allow it to happen.
Right. Okay, and one more question for me before we go to the audience. Was there anything about any of the characters that kind of surprised you as the book was being written? Did you like begin, you know, trying to write the story, telling the story in a certain way, and then something just kind of happened as the novel developed that kind of took you in a different direction?
Actually, the way she gets out of the relationship came as a surprise to me, because when I first embarked upon this, I kept thinking it would have to be, not necessarily that she throws herself under a train like Anna Karenina, but it would have to be something very dramatic, like she'd take a knife and stab him, or threaten to jump out of the window. The fact that she kind of reaches a willed decision surprised me.
You think that's to her benefit, you know, that she was able to get to that point?
Yeah, essentially, unless you want to end up dead.
Right, so she turned into a stronger character than you originally thought that she was going to be.
Yes.
Daphne Merkin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.